A life is slowly fading, not because it has lost its breath, but because it has abandoned all dreams, hope, and faith in life. A horse, its body shattered by too much pain, both physical and emotional, is now being pulled into the abyss of despair, unable to return. But when darkness fully consumes it, when all hope seems to have vanished, a man appears, not to save, but to test the ultimate limits of love and patience. Can a heart that has died be revived when everything has completely collapsed? Can hope emerge from the ashes? This story will make you believe that even when you think everything is over, life can still be reborn. Don't turn away, because this legendary story will take you on a journey you've never dared to imagine. The rain fell in sheets, cold and relentless, slamming against the old roof like a warning, an omen of both life and death. Each drop seemed to slice through the dark sky, leaving trails of light on the muddy earth below. The air was thick with moisture, heavy with sorrow, as if nature itself were mourning. The winds howled through the trees outside, snapping dry branches with a sound like the final, brittle cracks of a life slipping away. The farm had long been abandoned, now nothing but crumbling walls and a sagging roof, surrounded by wild overgrowth that spoke of neglect. Beside the stable, rotting planks were stacked haphazardly, part of the gate had fallen, revealing cracked earth where puddles formed, reflecting the darkened sky. Everything here felt like a forgotten memory, a place that no one had cared for or remembered in years. Inside the stable, the air was even heavier. The only light that pierced the darkness came from the narrow gaps in the old window, faint and pale, like a single ray of hope fighting to shine in the pitch-black night. In the far corner of the stable, Atlas stood motionless, a ghost of its former self, drained of all strength. Its frail body seemed incapable of holding itself up, the once powerful muscles now wasted, pale, and weak. Long, jagged scars marred its body, wounds deep and unhealed, the marks of a life that had been ravaged and forgotten. But the most painful thing of all was Atlas's eyes. Eyes that once gleamed with the wild freedom of a Mustang roaming the endless plains were now nothing but dark pools, void of life. They no longer held the fire of hope or the spark of resilience, only an overwhelming emptiness. It stared into the empty space before it, not out of curiosity or fear, but with a quiet resignation, as if in that gaze, it had abandoned everything. No fight left. No will to resist. It was the look of a soul that had suffered too much, for far too long, until there was nothing left to lose. Each breath Atlas took was heavy, its chest rising and falling as though each inhale was a struggle, each exhale a surrender. The cold winds outside seeped through the gaps in the stable, carrying a bone-chilling chill that made its body tremble once more. The cold didn't just seep into its flesh, it burrowed deep into its soul, feeding on the remnants of its spirit. Everywhere it gnawed, every vacant glance, seemed to say only one thing: I'm tired. I have nothing left. This was not merely a horse enduring physical pain. It was a story of a soul being consumed, of a creature cornered into despair, unable to believe in any salvation. And in that very darkness, where hope had long since vanished, a door creaked open, a faint light flickered. Was there anyone patient enough to pull Atlas from its slumber, to free it from the deep despair lodged in its heart? Then, a man stepped into the stable, Eli Turner. His tall frame, though imposing, moved with a weariness that seemed to weigh him down with every step, as if each footfall carried a burden too heavy to bear. His face, strong and chiseled, could not hide the worry and sorrow in his eyes. Those eyes, a cloudy gray blue, seemed dulled by the pain they had witnessed, burdened by memories and failures that refused to fade. Eli wore a worn leather coat, faded and frayed with the passage of time, small cracks in the fabric like scars on his own life. His hands, rough and calloused from years of treating injuries, were gentle as he reached out to Atlas. His dark gray hair was disheveled, slightly unkempt, as if he hadn't had time to care for himself in the long nights spent with his patients. His chin sagged, a faint stubble tracing the outline of a man who had long since forgotten peace. The dim light caught his face, highlighting the lines of exhaustion and the weight of countless sleepless nights. Though his exterior was tough, Eli could not conceal the deep sorrow within. He wasn't just a veterinarian, he was a man carrying the weight of his decisions, the unspoken promise that no creature under his watch would ever suffer in silence again. As Eli stood before Atlas, the weight of its past heavy in the air, he realized that to heal this broken creature, he needed to understand what had led it here. Only by facing the darkness of its past could he begin to restore what had been lost. Before Atlas became the shadow of its former self, it was a Mustang, wild and free. Atlas had once run across the vast, open plains, its coat shining under the sun, muscles rippling with each powerful stride. The wind was its constant companion, rushing through its mane, whispering freedom in every gust. Atlas had known no boundaries. The world was endless, and its spirit matched it, untamed, unbroken. It was strength and grace combined, running for the sheer joy of existence, with no chain to bind it, no hand to control it. In those moments, Atlas was more than just a horse. It was the embodiment of the wild heart of the American West, a creature that lived not just to survive, but to revel in its freedom. The earth trembled beneath its hooves, the open sky stretched endlessly above, and for Atlas, this was home. Freedom was not just a word, it was the very essence of life. But that life, so vibrant, so full of promise, was stolen in an instant. The day Atlas was captured was the day it lost its soul. The wild Mustang, once so full of life, now faced a force it could not outrun. The men who pursued Atlas were relentless, closing in with ropes and traps, each step of the chase a brutal reminder of the inevitable. Atlas fought with everything it had, kicking and rearing, its body screaming for freedom. But the ropes tightened around its neck, pulling it down until there was no fight left to give. Dragged from the only world it had ever known, Atlas was thrown into a life of captivity, a life where its every move was controlled, its will crushed. The men who captured it saw only a prize to be broken, a creature to be tamed. They cared not for Atlas's spirit, only for how quickly they could strip it away. The whip cracked across its back, the sting of each lash a reminder that this was no longer the life it had known. Atlas was beaten, starved, and forced into submission. Each strike shattered a little more of the Mustang's pride, until it stood, battered and bruised, a shadow of its former self. It had been made to obey, to bend, until the fight within it was snuffed out completely. The physical scars on Atlas were easy to see, but the real damage lay deeper. Atlas had trusted once, had believed that the world could be kind, that there was a place for it to belong. But the cruel hands that had promised safety had become the very hands that broke it. Now, the only thing Atlas felt when touched was fear, fear that each hand would bring more pain, more loss. The loneliness was suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of other creatures, it was the isolation within itself. The very soul of Atlas had been locked away, buried beneath layers of hurt and distrust. It had once lived with the wind in its mane, the vast sky above. Now, it stood in silence, trapped in a world that no longer made sense, its heart torn between the longing for the freedom it had lost and the fear that it could never escape its prison. Atlas no longer understood the world around it. Where it had once felt the thrill of the open air, it now felt only the weight of the chains that bound it, not just physically, but emotionally. Its trust had been shattered, and with it, the very foundation of who it had once been. The wild Mustang was gone, replaced by a broken soul, lost and wandering in its own pain. Standing before the broken creature, Eli could feel the depth of its suffering. He knew that to heal Atlas would take more than just tending to its wounds. The scars ran deeper than any visible injury. What Atlas had lost was more than its body, it had lost its spirit, its very will to live. But Eli wasn't ready to give up. As much as the weight of Atlas's past crushed him, there was still a flicker of life in those eyes. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And that small spark of hope was enough to ignite Eli's resolve. He knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with difficulty, but he also knew that Atlas was worth it. Eli had faced pain in his own life, losses that had shaped him in ways he couldn't fully express. And in that pain, he found a connection with Atlas, because they were both creatures scarred by their pasts, each struggling to find a way forward. As much as he wanted to restore Atlas to what it once was, Eli knew that healing would come not just from fixing what was broken, but from helping Atlas reclaim the life it had lost. As Eli watched the faintest flicker of trust begin to shine through in Atlas's eyes, he knew that this journey of healing would be long and slow. But each small step, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was a victory. He wasn't just healing a horse, he was helping it rediscover hope, and in the process, he was beginning to heal himself. The days slowly turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Eli's care for Atlas became more than just a task, it became a promise. At first, it was a battle to get Atlas to even look in his direction, let alone come near him. Atlas still flinched at every movement, still shied away from the softest touch. Every time Eli reached out, there was a moment of hesitation, a moment where the fear in Atlas's eyes made it clear that trust had to be earned, not demanded. Eli never forced the horse. He respected its boundaries and gave it the time it needed. When Atlas refused food, Eli didn't push it. Instead, he sat quietly beside it, speaking softly, giving the horse the space it needed. He knew that healing wasn't something that could be rushed. Every moment of progress, no matter how small, was a victory. When Atlas finally accepted food from his hand, it was a breakthrough, but it wasn't the end. Eli knew that true healing would come not just through physical care but through patience, compassion, and quiet consistency. There were days when Atlas still seemed distant, when the wounds, both visible and invisible, seemed too deep to heal. Eli didn't grow frustrated. He knew that healing wasn't linear, and sometimes, the hardest part was waiting. But there was no anger in his heart, only an overwhelming desire to help this horse feel safe, to make Atlas believe, once again, that there was kindness in the world. Then, one day, the smallest of gestures marked the first true change. Atlas's ears flicked slightly in Eli's direction. It wasn't much, just a subtle movement, but to Eli, it was a signal that the horse was beginning to take notice, to understand that he was there to help, not hurt. The trust was growing, though it was fragile. A few days later, Atlas took a small, tentative step toward Eli, as if to test the waters. It was a cautious movement, its legs shaky, but it was a step. Not a leap, not a grand gesture, but a shift, nonetheless. For the first time, Atlas didn't pull back in fear. Instead, it stayed close, watching Eli, its large eyes filled with hesitation but also a hint of curiosity. Eli stayed still, giving Atlas the space it needed to process. Slowly, Atlas came closer, its breath soft, steady. Eli's heart swelled with quiet pride, but he knew this wasn't a moment for celebration. It was just a step in a long journey. Every day, every inch that Atlas moved toward him, Eli met with patience, understanding, and an unwavering belief that this horse, despite everything it had been through, still had the power to trust again. In those moments, when words weren't needed, the bond between Eli and Atlas grew deeper. Eli began to notice the way Atlas's body language changed with his presence. The way the horse's ears would flicker when Eli spoke, or how it would lean ever so slightly when he moved closer. It wasn't the big, dramatic gestures that defined their relationship. It was the small, unspoken exchanges that spoke volumes. There was something sacred about these quiet moments, the silent communication between them. Atlas no longer saw Eli as a threat but as a source of comfort, of care. And in return, Eli felt a connection to Atlas that he hadn't expected. He was healing not just Atlas, but himself. In giving his heart to this broken animal, Eli realized that he was reclaiming something he had lost along the way, faith. Faith in the goodness of the world, faith that no matter how shattered something may seem, there is always a chance for renewal. As the weeks passed, Eli couldn't help but reflect on the way he had been changed by this journey. Every day spent with Atlas was a reminder of how far they both had come. It was no longer just about the horse, it was about the bond they shared, about helping each other heal. Atlas's body began to recover, but its spirit was where the real change happened. The more Eli gave, the more Atlas opened up. The trust, once shattered, began to rebuild. And in those small moments of connection, when Atlas stepped forward or nuzzled into Eli's palm, eyes soft with a gentleness that had been absent before, Eli knew they were on the path to something more than just physical recovery. Even though Eli had seen signs of Atlas's recovery, he knew the road ahead would not be easy. The trust between them had slowly been built, but the greatest challenge still lay ahead. And at this very moment, when they felt closer than ever, a powerful resistance from Atlas would test Eli's patience and force him to confront fears he had never fully understood. Atlas's sudden resistance on a spring morning, as soft light filtered into the stable through the old, weathered windows, Eli stepped inside, softly calling Atlas's name like a familiar greeting. He had no idea that today would be the day everything would change. As he approached, a sudden shift in the air made him stop. A tension hung thick in the atmosphere, as if an invisible shadow had descended over the space. Atlas stood there, eyes fixed on Eli, but instead of approaching him as usual, the horse stood motionless, its gaze sharp with an unmistakable alertness. The moments stretched on endlessly. Eli stood still, feeling the tension in the air, the gaze of Atlas now a shield of defense. Then, without warning, Atlas turned sharply. Its head stretched toward Eli, eyes challenging, as if to say, "Don't come any closer." A loud bang echoed through the air. Atlas struck the stable door, its back legs crashing down hard, sending dirt and debris flying, clouding the space around them. The force of the horse's body swayed violently, its eyes cold and piercing, as if looking right through Eli. This wasn't just ordinary fear, it was a powerful, decisive rebellion. Inside Atlas, an uncontrollable inner battle was raging. It wasn't just rejecting Eli's help, it was rejecting everything it had endured. Then, with another ear-splitting roar, Atlas bared its sharp teeth, and the air in the stable felt heavy and compressed. Eli froze, his body stiffening for a moment. It felt as though Atlas's soul was rebelling, unleashing an unpredictable strength within the horse. Fear surged through Eli, a tidal wave crashing over him, drowning out all thoughts and making it hard for him to breathe. Atlas, once a free and wild spirit, now seemed like a wounded warrior, ready to fight to protect itself. Eli realized that now was not the time to approach. This was a test of his patience and deep understanding of the pain Atlas had suffered. He understood that this resistance was not just about fear. Atlas was resisting control, resisting the hurt it had endured, the deep fear that everything it had been through would happen again. In a moment of deep fear, Eli asked himself, "Do I really have the ability to save Atlas? Can I heal the deep wounds this horse has suffered, when it no longer trusts anyone?" Eli does not give up. Eli's heart seemed to stop, the space around him becoming dull and suffocating. The advice from those around him, the patience he had honed over years, now felt like it was about to shatter. He was not just facing a horse, he was facing the deepest fear within himself. Thoughts like sharp knives stabbed through his mind. Can I really save Atlas? Can I break through the thick walls this horse has built around itself? The feeling of helplessness surged, as powerful as a storm. The countless days he had spent caring for Atlas, pouring all his energy into it, now felt like it was all in vain. A wave of hopelessness swept through him, making him question if all of this was just a futile struggle. Atlas, with all its wounds and tension, was resisting him like a mirror reflecting Eli's own despair. But then, in that moment, something shifted inside Eli. Exhaustion didn't make him falter, it made him sharper than ever. Eli understood that patience was the only strength he had to offer Atlas. Despite the doubts and helplessness, he knew that perseverance was the only way forward. He couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. Eli stood firm, not moving closer, not retreating. Every second felt like a journey of patience, one where nothing could make him take a step back. Each breath was a step closer to salvation, not just for Atlas, but for himself, in the quiet journey of waiting and trusting that one day, Atlas would open its heart. The psychological growth of Atlas's resistance was not just physical. It was a deep response from within its soul. The sense of betrayal, the feeling of abandonment, had left Atlas unable to trust humans anymore. The painful memories of trust shattered had caused it to shut itself off, unwilling to open its heart again. In Atlas's eyes, there was not only the fear of the physical pain it had endured. There was a deeper fear. It feared that if it opened up again, it would face the same disappointment and hurt once more. The wounds unseen, the scars within, were the invisible barriers that kept Atlas withdrawn. Every time Eli approached, it didn't feel like comfort. What Atlas felt was the fear of being abandoned again. Was this help just another trap? Could it trust Eli, and endure again? But in those moments of silence, Atlas wondered if it could find its freedom again, after having suffered so much. Would it ever have the courage to trust once more? The feeling of helplessness and Eli's determination. Eli stood there, feeling helpless, as if all his strength had drained away, an invisible weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The chaos in his mind was like a storm, relentlessly sweeping through his thoughts, but the worst of it was the fear of losing faith in himself. Questions kept crashing in. Do I have the strength to save Atlas? Can I help this horse find its way back? But in that moment of desperation, a thought flickered in his mind. Patience was the key. It wasn't physical strength that mattered, but the love and trust that never faded. He would not give up. No matter how hopeless everything seemed, he would not abandon Atlas. Not ever. Each time Atlas resisted, Eli drew closer, not with his body, but with a heart steadfast and infinite in its patience. He understood that sometimes, to save a creature, you have to wait until they choose to open their heart again. Eli's past memories as the silence in the stable deepened. A moment of calm allowed Eli to hear his own breath. Then, memories of a horse he couldn't save flooded back. The horse's eyes, filled with fear and despair, never left his mind. That horse had been abandoned in the storm, left alone to face the raging waves, and Eli had been helpless. The memory lingered like a ghost, constantly haunting him, making his heart ache once more. But it was this very memory that kept Eli from giving up on Atlas. The journey to save Atlas wasn't just an external battle, it was an internal war he had to fight within himself. He had to face his fear of failure, the guilt of not being able to save that previous horse. But this time, Eli wouldn't let the pain of the past block the hope for the future. He knew that if he didn't fight, if he didn't persist, he would live with that regret forever. After all the challenges, the resistance, and the deep fears, Eli gradually realized that this journey was not just about saving Atlas. As Atlas stepped into the vast expanse of freedom, Eli understood that he, too, had been healed. That moment was not just the horse's liberation, but his own as well, in a long journey filled with patience and hope. Atlas finally finds freedom. The spring morning light broke through the thin clouds, spilling over the vast field before Atlas. The golden rays spread across the earth, casting a warm glow on the soft green grass, which lay like a floating carpet. Gentle winds caressed each blade of grass, brushing the moist earth and carrying the scent of fresh soil. The landscape seemed to awaken from a long slumber, vibrant and full of life. Atlas stood at the edge of the field, his hooves firmly planted on the solid ground. The vastness of the space around him seemed to create a sense of anticipation in his heart. His eyes swept across the endless sky, a mixture of hesitation and yearning. Part of him was unsure whether he should step into this world of freedom. But another part of him burned with an intense longing, an unspoken desire that could not be captured in words. In his gaze, there was waiting, a tug of inner conflict, but also a shining hope, illuminated by the first light of dawn. Then, without a sound, Atlas took his first step. At first, his movements were cautious, as if he were testing the ground, filled with worry and uncertainty. But gradually, the strength of his spirit began to show. His legs steadied on the earth, sinking into the grass beneath, rising like firm pillars of resolve. Each step was not just a physical movement but a spiritual ascent. The wounds of his past, the painful memories of captivity and suffering, could not vanish in an instant, but each step was a testament to his rebirth. As Atlas began to run, his first strides were heavy, imperfect. But gradually, freedom began to dominate his body. The powerful strikes of his hooves against the earth echoed like calls for freedom from deep within his soul. With each thundering step, a strong sensation spread through his body, affirming the life and freedom that had been denied him for so long. The entire field seemed to glow, as if welcoming the liberation of a soul that had been caged for far too long. It wasn't just his body running, it was Atlas's spirit, too. Each step he took was not only a declaration of his right to live, but also an act of defiance against all that had caused him pain, that had confined him and stifled his breath. Atlas was no longer a horse shackled by the painful past, he was a powerful soul, no longer afraid, no longer held back. He was reclaiming the freedom that was his by right, and nothing could stop him. The field stretched endlessly before him, the sky opening up like a new land, a new life, a place where there were no limits, no fear. Atlas ran, as if all the dark days had been nothing more than a long dream, and now was the moment he returned to his wild instincts. The freedom in every stride, in each forceful strike of his hooves, was not just of the body, but of a soul set free, a soul that had found itself once again. Eli and Atlas, an unconditional bond. Eli stood at the edge of the field, his eyes fixed on every stride of Atlas as the horse ran, unable to tear his gaze away. Each powerful strike of Atlas's hooves against the earth was a vivid testament to the freedom it had regained, a symbol of a journey they had both shared, filled with sacrifice and determination. The dark memories of the past, the pain, the disappointment, and the despair, slowly faded away, no longer present in the air. In that moment, Eli realized something profound. This journey was not only about saving a suffering horse, but it was also a journey of his own salvation. He wasn't just healing Atlas. Through this process, he was healing the deep wounds in his own soul. The moments spent caring for the horse had become priceless lessons in unconditional love, patience, and forgiveness, not just toward the animal but also toward himself. The bond between Eli and Atlas was no longer simply about healing, it was a deep understanding, a love that had transcended fear, loneliness, and the invisible scars both of them carried. Eli understood that love was not conditional or forced, it was about presence, about standing together even in the most difficult times. He hadn't just helped Atlas regain its freedom, he had found himself again, a version of himself he had long lost. As Atlas ran, its legs cutting through the air, Eli felt the freedom not only of the horse but of himself. The days of care, the healing of wounds, were significant, but the most important realization for Eli was this: salvation doesn't come from changing someone, it comes from accepting and loving them completely, no matter how painful their past may be. And in that moment, when Atlas turned to look at Eli, its eyes no longer holding doubt, fear, or suspicion, Eli felt an overwhelming joy fill his chest. It was the look of understanding, of connection between two souls that had once been broken but were now finding peace. Eli knew that not only had Atlas found freedom, but he himself had too. And the most precious thing of all was the unconditional bond between human and animal. This wasn't just physical salvation, it was a spiritual rebirth, a love with no. After all the challenges, the pain, and the internal struggles had been faced and overcome, the freedom that Atlas and Eli achieved was not just a physical release. It was also a spiritual rebirth. But their story is not only about the free running of a horse or the patience of a veterinarian. It is also a profound lesson on forgiveness, patience, and a humanistic message that we must all take the time to listen to and reflect upon. The bond between Eli and Atlas is not merely about healing a suffering horse, it is a journey of deeper recovery, a human journey rooted in patience, forgiveness, and the strength of unconditional love. They did not just overcome physical wounds but also healed invisible scars, the emotional wounds formed by years of mistreatment and pain. Their story is a wake-up call about animal cruelty and the harshness of a society that often overlooks the weakness and suffering of creatures that cannot defend themselves. What Atlas endured serves as a silent yet brutal reminder of the atrocities countless innocent beings face. However, their story does not stop at sympathy. It's a call to patience, not just for animals, but for ourselves as we confront the painful memories of the past. Eli, who dedicated countless days to caring for Atlas, did not just help the horse recover, in the process, he too healed. The patience he showed Atlas was not merely waiting for the horse to open up, but a patience directed inward, a patience for himself. He realized that to help any living being overcome pain and trauma, it requires not just patience, but unconditional love, a love not based on what someone can offer, but a love based on the simple fact that every being deserves love and acceptance. One of the greatest lessons that Eli and Atlas' journey imparts is forgiveness. Forgiveness is not only for others but for ourselves as well. The wounds from the past, whether they belong to the horse or to Eli, cannot be healed in a single night. However, by allowing ourselves and the creatures we love a chance to heal, we find the strength to move beyond what has happened. Forgiveness is a long and difficult process, but it is the only way we can truly release our pain and move toward a future free of the chains of the past. As Atlas runs free across the vast field, it's not just freedom of the body, it's freedom from deep within the soul. It is a rebirth after so much suffering and hardship. The story of Atlas and Eli is not only about a horse finding freedom, but also about a man finding himself, healing his own spiritual wounds. They did not only save each other, they helped one another find true freedom. True love doesn't come from changing someone, but from accepting and loving them fully, even when their past is filled with pain. When we learn to forgive and accept, not only others but also ourselves, we will find genuine freedom and peace. This story helps us understand that patience, unconditional love, and forgiveness are the paths to rebirth, for both humans and animals. Only when we learn to love unconditionally can we truly free ourselves from the wounds of the past and embrace a life that is whole, meaningful, and free, where every day is filled with hope.